in terms of like what reason might a God have for being hidden, again, if we go for the most obvious explanation would be the reason why God would keep himself hidden from us is that it's not important for him that we recognize who he is and worship him, etc., right? That seems to be the most simplest explanation. So it goes back to, one can believe in a God that is hidden and think, well, who knows the mind of God anyway? Who knows what's God's reasons? But the very fact that God is hidden seems to be very good reason to think that if a God exists, it's not really half as bothered about whether we pray to the right one or not as our religious leaders have made us think. So I think that is a really strong and obvious, clear bit of explanation. So if you're going to have an alternative explanation as to why God should be hidden, it needs to be a pretty good one. And I mean, we could say more about this, because I think I appreciate you probably stopped before you finished all you could say on this. But I think the idea that God needs to be hidden in order for us to sort of choose him freely, let's put it that way. Well, there are a couple of things. I mean, the allegory from Kierkegaard isn't perfect, of course, but the idea there is that the king doesn't hide himself completely. He just hides his full nature. He goes to the woman. He shows he exists. He just doesn't reveal his full nature, right? Whereas the problem with divine hiddenness is that we don't even see God. It exists at all, let alone the full nature being hidden. But the second thing is, if the purpose of being hidden is so that when we choose to have that relationship with God, we do so freely from our own volition. If that's the purpose, then you think, well, this world has been very, very poorly designed by the God to bring that about, because he's hidden himself in such a way that your chances of finding him and recognizing him are not impossible, but it's down to pure luck and chance a lot of the time. Because I say, you grew up in a Muslim majority country, you grew up in a Christian majority country, you grew up in an East Asian country where it's not traditionally theist. This is going to be the main determinant of whether you recognize God or not. So it seems that, yes, there's a rational reason why God might not want to make, I'm saying his, I don't want to say his, because his is a traditional thing of Christianity, lots of other religion. Again, I think it's very weird actually to attribute a gender to a god, because sex is biological. You get it through mammals. The idea that the divine entity would have a sex, I think, is a bit crazy. But I'll sometimes say it, he, whatever it might be. If God exists and it was important in any way to have the relationship with it seems the hiddenness would be totally mysterious. So I think that's why I'm not persuaded. I can see how someone might think, yes, it's important we don't just all bow down out of total fear, but God seems too hidden. You know what I mean? There's making your nature a little bit obscure, so we've got to work things out for ourselves and make a choice. But if you make yourself so hidden that the vast majority of people are going to either not recognize you at all or choose a wrong version of you, that's a much, much more implausible explanation of the fact that if God exists and God is hidden, it's because this God doesn't really care too much about whether we worship him or it. Cares more about other things. Maybe cares more about whether we're kind, whether we're compassionate, whether we try and sort of do our best by other people. That's the kind of God. I can more believe in that kind of God than the kind of God who says, do you know what, the most important thing about your life is whether or not you recognize me and give me love. That sounds a bit narcissistic. I'm being a little bit provocative maybe there, but the general point I stand by.
That's very good, thank you. May I ask, because obviously we're dealing here with we're talking in terms of a personal God, an impersonal God, whatever, but what sort of evidence would work for you, or what sort of evidence would you expect to believe in the personal God like the Christian God?
Well, I think this is an interesting one, because I think I often have discussions with religious people, and I find them interesting. They're much more interesting talking with another atheist, right? It's always more interesting to talk about someone who is thoughtful and intelligent who disagrees with you than it is to talk with someone who's thoughtful, intelligent and agrees with you, because all you're getting is reinforcement. And I found over the years that there's a recurring thing which you get to in the end in a discussion about God. You have these discussions in which we'll talk about rational reasons for the belief in God, evidence, etc. In my experience, I think you allude to this at the end of the book back, so I'm curious to see if you agree. I think most people who have a religious faith, right, or at least a Christian faith, let's put it that way, the most fundamental reason for it is that they have felt at some time in their life, and perhaps ongoing in their life, the presence of God in their life. They have felt in some way that God has spoken to them, has called to them, whatever language they use. So actually, the kind of evidence which persuades people of a personal God is a very strong personal experience that personal God has in some way spoken to them. And that seems to be the fundamentally basic thing. So I sometimes think that all the other arguments we have about evidence, etc., are forms of what people call apologetics. So apologetics, and again, correct me if I got the definition slightly wrong. Apologetics is where you start with a religious faith, a religious belief, and then you have certain intellectual problems, philosophical problems that belief entails. And so you need to come up with an explanation for how you can maintain your faith in the face of these problems. So the problem of evil is one. You believe in a good God, and it seems to be, but there's so much evil in the world, that is a problem. So you're investigating this issue not neutrally, you're investigating it from the position of someone who has a faith and needs to find a way of making that evil compatible with your belief. In the same way, if you have a faith, you may want to sort of like find ways of making the hiddenness and lack of strong evidence for God's existence compatible with your faith. These things are totally respectable things to do, of course, but I think the honesty is saying what actually grounds your belief in God is that personal experience. Now, you say, what would it matter for me? I can't speak about that in a way. I mean, I tried to be a Christian, I tried to have the personal experiences, etc., etc. It didn't work for me. I have reasons for thinking that in general people should not trust that kind of experience. I don't know. Maybe if I did have some kind of personal experience which was so powerful that I couldn't argue with, maybe that would make me believe. I don't know.
Right, thank you. Max, I'd like to give you a chance to respond to anything Julian said or to summarise before we take some questions.
No, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I don't actually disagree with a great deal of what Julian just said there. I mean, so let me just pick up on what he said about Kierkegaard and the parables. So you said that, in the parable, the king doesn't completely make himself invisible. It's just that his true nature as king is invisible. So, yeah, I mean, so I think you could argue that actually that is roughly analogous to the situation that we find among human beings across history and time and space, in the sense that the vast majority of human beings, and that there is empirical research on this, have tended to believe it not just in the supernatural but in some kind of high God. Then you're absolutely right. The great diversity and disagreement comes in with respect to exactly what that high God is like and how has he revealed himself in history. But then again, I mean, that does seem kind of analogous to the Kierkegaard thing. Yes. Now you were saying like the most obvious explanation for divine hiddenness, sort of from in a sense, an explanation that's compatible with there being some kind of God is that God doesn't care terribly much what people think about what that God is like. And I do have some sympathy with that. Like let's put it like this. I think a version of religious belief, a version of theism that says that, essentially a person's eternal fate is highly contingent on them having very specifically correct intellectual beliefs about the nature of God. Yet look at this world and how much of an accident of birth it is which religious system you're exposed to. I think that's going to be very difficult to defend. I have some sympathy with the point you're making there. I guess I'm trying to think if there's anything else.
Do you agree? Is it in your experience too? Do you think that what people experience as a personal encounter with God is what grounds most people's faith?
Yes, I think that's correct. Yeah.
Yeah, that's difficult because I know friends who have a very sincere desire to experience God. They've maybe been to church and maybe even had people pray for them. They've read the Bible or whichever holy book, and yet it's not happened for them. Mm-hmm. Do you think God might have good reasons for kind of? Some people seem to get an experience, and other people either have to wait a very long time or don't get it. What?
I mean, yeah, it's so hard to say anything intelligent and concrete about this because you're speculating about someone else's psychology. Yeah, it's so hard to without being given, huge amounts of specifics about the case. I think it's pretty hard to say very much.
Yeah, and you can't just sort of test God and say like, well, if you give me an experience, then I'll believe in you. If you show up in this certain way, I mean, if I do this, then you
put it like this. So I haven't always been a Christian. I was an agnostic until I was about 18, and as a teenager. From time to time, I would sort of throw up a prayer when I kind of really wanted something or needed something. And I think I thought at the time that I was sort of adopting the right attitude of openness to God. If there was a God out there, I was doing the right sort of thing. It wasn't until later in my late teens, early 20s that I became a Christian. And that was for a mixture of reasons, partly intellectual, perhaps partly experiential. But then if I look back at my teenage self, praying for things and thinking that he was sort of appropriately open, I'm now not sure about that. I think probably I was more treating God like a vending machine in the sky. So I don't know. Yeah, but I'm not saying that that's the case for everyone who's in that situation. I just don't know, because we're talking about other people's psychology.